You simply cannot lose body fat when your insulin levels are high and you're eating. You can't, because your body is getting the instructions to store calories, not burn calories. One thing that really stops autophagy is protein.
Dr. Jason Fung, the founder of Intermittent Fasting and the best-selling author of The Obesity Code.
He's on a mission to fix the obesity epidemic and save your life before it's too late.
So if you think the calories comes first, then you simply say cut 500 calories from your diet every day and you will lose a pound a week. That's the standard advice that we've given for 30 years. Has it helped? Not at all. The obesity epidemic has gone way up. And so it's not calories, it's really the insulin. And if you think about weight gain, obesity as a excess of insulin, then you can say, well, how do you lower insulin? Now you use something like intermittent fasting, for example, where you allow insulin levels to fall. As you allow insulin levels to fall, you take away this block to fat burning and sugar burning.
What do you think about breakfast?
The whole thing about breakfast, on the one hand, if you eat your calories earlier, it is better for you than eating later. Every day you should have about 12 to 14 hours. That's just regular. Then if you want to lose weight, then you can push it up.
What's better, fasting or Ozempic?
I think they're different. Over the last 5 years, I'll tell you that it's far from a panacea. People think it's great, it's going to cure everything. But the truth is that a lot of people just don't stay on it.
When it comes to weight loss and preventing chronic health conditions, there are so many different protocols, supplements, and diets. But it's important to understand what works for somebody else might not work for you. And that's why in this episode, I had the honor of speaking with Dr. Jason Fung. Dr. Jason Fung will explain the 3 main principles to help your body burn body fat and also prevent chronic disease through what you eat, but most importantly, when you eat. And it's not about lowering calories. And if you're learning from and enjoying these episodes, please hit the subscribe button. That is an excellent zero-cost way to support this free health podcast, because this information is not what you'll hear from Big Food or Big Pharma. And by subscribing, you can help share this message to millions more people that need to hear it. Thank you. Dr. Fung, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
When we think about people around us, it could be our family, it could be our friends. We probably know somebody that is overweight, severely overweight, or has a metabolic disease like diabetes, cancer, dementia, even heart disease. And we're told there's nothing that we can do about it. But Dr. Fung, you say otherwise. You say the reason why we're sick and fat is because we've been focusing on the wrong thing. So today, Dr. Fung is going to share his decades of experience and talk about a very simple way that you can make your body burn fat and reverse metabolic disease, and why this is better than any medication that you can take, including Ozempic. So Dr. Fung, my first question, let's talk about losing weight, fixing obesity. What is the biggest cause of obesity?
Essentially, I think that the problem is hyperinsulinemia, which is really a hormonal issue. And this comes down to, a lot of people will say, well, it's about too many calories or something like that. However, I think that doesn't really address the actual underlying problem, because the thing is that our bodies respond to hormones, right? So if we're gaining body fat, then it's because the hormones have signaled us to gain body fat. Really, every single system in our body works the same way. Nothing happens by accident. And it's because in order for us to, regulate this very highly complex system, which has lots of interconnections, everybody has to know what's happening with everything else. So insulin is a hormone that essentially tells us to store body fat. That's sort of its job, right? So when you eat, the hormone insulin is going to rise, and therefore that's a signal for us to store some of it as body fat, which is essentially a store of calories, right? So it doesn't happen by accident. Everybody has this mistaken notion that we have a certain amount that we put in, a certain amount that we that we burn, and any excess goes into fat. And that part that goes into fat is completely unregulated, but it's simply not true. It's actually completely inconceivable that the body works that way. And the reason is that for most of us, the body weight stays stable. For example, if you think about weight gain. The average over the last 30, 40 years, really, even with this entire obesity epidemic, is about a pound a year. A pound of body fat is about 3,500 calories, which is about 2 days worth of eating, which means that our bodies we have to match the amount of calories we eat with the calories we burn to within like a 99%, failure rate, right? Like there can be essentially no errors. Yet we don't know how many calories we eat and how many calories we burn. So how can you maintain it within a 99% sort of accuracy without that? So this idea that it's simply some unregulated dump of calories is not true. So if you think about it that way, then what happens is people just say, oh, you eat less calories, which is just not useful advice. I don't know why people think it's useful. Like that's the same advice that we've been giving for 25, 35 years, and it really hasn't helped anybody. You look at the number of people who have had struggled with it, and essentially all of them have done calorie counting, and it doesn't work. So it's not understanding that it's not calories, because our bodies respond to hormones. There is certain calories are going to stimulate insulin more than other calories. So if you eat cookies, you're going to stimulate insulin more, which means you're going to store more of that as body fat, which simply means, and you compare that to an egg, for example, then you don't stimulate as much insulin, which means you don't store as much of those calories as fat, and you burn more of those calories, right? That's all that happens. And the whole idea, which is simply that we're just saying that some foods are more fattening than other foods, right? So cookies are more fattening than broccoli or eggs, which isn't really that far a stretch. Like how many people do you really have said, well, I got fat because I ate too much broccoli, right? Like, come on, never, right? But if you say, oh, I eat too much cookies, sure, that could totally gain to make you take too many chips. I made too many, too much junk food, too much fast food, sure, candy, any of that. But, oh, I ate too much salmon. It's like, I don't know. I don't know that that's actually a reason. So it's not calories. It's really the insulin. And if you think about weight gain, obesity as a excess of insulin, then you can say, well, how do you lower insulin, right? Because that sets you on the right track. And that means to say that, you want to eat foods that don't stimulate as much insulin, as in eat more food that's less fattening for you. Which again, if you simply go back, to the 60s and 70s, you could find all this advice in all the popular media, right? Like, don't eat cookies if you want to eat weight. Cut out the starchy foods, cut out the sugary foods, cut out the desserts, cut out the snacks, right? And it's very simple. But see, the thing about hyperinsulinemia. So if you think about insulin, is a hormone that tells your body to gain weight. That's its job. The problem is that you have too much of it. And the reason you have too much of it is because you're eating foods that stimulate it more than it should. But you can also see that a lot of the diseases that follow along are also diseases of too much insulin. So type 2 diabetes is also a disease where it's very easy to measure. You measure insulin levels, they're sky high. The disease is that you have too much insulin. So therefore you have to lower it. And if obesity and type 2 diabetes then lead to all those other diseases like heart attacks and strokes and all those other things. And again, you can follow the medical literature, and you can see hyperinsulinemia is a huge risk factor for all kinds of diseases, including cancers, including heart disease and all that. So a lot of these diseases are diseases of sort of hyperinsulinemia, which come back down to not simply eating too many calories. That's not the issue. Like, you eat a lot of broccoli, like you can eat excessive amounts of broccoli, like calories like broccoli, and you simply won't gain weight, right? Because other things will happen. Your body's going to adjust, because if you're not stimulating the insulin, you're eating all those calories, well, your body's going to burn it, right? It's not going to store it because you didn't tell it to store it. And because of that, then you're going to want to stop eating it because your body has natural satiety mechanisms. Whereas if you store it, and this is the thing, I don't really understand how these calorie people don't understand this. Suppose you eat a food that is very stimulating for insulin. So you eat white bread and jam, right? Lots of sugar, lots of refined carbohydrates. So we know that the minute you eat that food, that you can eat, say, 100 calories of that compared to 100 calories of an egg. The difference is that the white bread and jam is going to spike your insulin through the roof, whereas the egg is not, right? So you have to pretend that those that hormones simply don't matter for our body, which is obviously a very difficult thing to reconcile. However, if you say, okay, that insulin, you take 100 calories, insulin spikes way high, okay, with the white bread and jam. That's going to tell your body to store all of those calories. So now those 100 calories goes directly into fat stores, because that's how your body stores calories. Well, if all of that went into your stores, you have nothing left, right, to use for energy. So you eat that white bread and jam, if a few hours later, your body's like, I have no energy because everything's stored away. I can't use it. So therefore, it's going to make you want to go eat, which is exactly what happens, of course. So you eat that white bread and jam, which is all refined carbs. Then by 10:30, you're just ravenous. So you're looking for something else to eat, right? Whereas you eat that egg, your body didn't store that much of it as calories, so therefore it's burning it, and it's not going and you're not going to need to eat at 10:30. So it's like, all these people say it's all about calories, all about calories. Like, what are you talking about, right? What happens to those calories the minute you put them in your mouth is completely different depending on what the hormones tell it to do. So why do you pretend that it's completely irrelevant? And by ignoring that sort of physiology of what happens to food and hormones in our body, they sort of set up this entire thing where everybody's just sort of counting calories, so they're eating these foods, but they're not watching what's happening after that. A lot of it gets stored away. So therefore, at the same time that they're storing all this excess, body fat, because it's a store of calories, they're ravenously hungry and wondering, why am I so hungry? It's like, well, because you didn't sort of fix that whole problem where you need to use, instead of storing energy, you want to use the energy. So the whole thing is sort of misguided, and it's always a little bit, I always get a little discouraged that people don't, there's no effort to make people have people understand this, right? All the sort of, you talk to any so-called experts or, dietitians and doctors and stuff, and it's all about calories. Well, why don't you pay attention to what type of calories you're eating? Because it's really important. Like, it's not like irrelevant, right? Which people say it is, because they're like, oh, 100 calories of cookies is as fattening as 100 calories of broccoli. No, they're not, because the way you store it is different depending on what happens to your hormones once you eat it.
Absolutely. I think, the work that you do, it does touch a lot of people and it helps so many people. I posted on X or Twitter that I'm speaking to you today, and so many people said, Dr. Jason Fung has changed my life. So the work that you do, the work that a lot of the doctors that I have on my podcast channel do, changes the people's lives. We're going to touch more about hormones versus calories so that people have a deep understanding of the difference and insulin. But Dr. Fung, you are a nephrologist, a kidney doctor, and you wrote a New York Times bestselling book, The Obesity Code. Why did you write that book?
I think it was because I was very interested in the question of how to reverse type 2 diabetes. So a lot of kidney disease is caused by type 2 diabetes. And type 2 diabetes is essentially quite simple to understand. It's basically your body has too much sugar. Remember that glucose. When we talk about sugar, you don't talk about table sugar, but and that's a glucose and fructose, which is sucrose. But sugar is a generic term that includes glucose. So if you eat carbohydrates like bread, starchy foods, basically, starches are long chains of glucose, which is a sugar, right? So when your body has too much glucose, then it can store some of it, but then eventually it spills out in the blood. Your blood glucose, which is your blood sugar, goes up, and you get diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, which is really the biggest cause of kidney disease in the United States and Canada. Then, of course, we've had this big epidemic of obesity, then an epidemic of type 2 diabetes, which is leading to more kidney disease. So a few years ago, probably about 10 years ago, I was very, you know, I started to really question what I had been taught, which is that type 2 diabetes is a chronic and progressive disease. And I realized that it wasn't. It was actually just a lie. And it was funny because at the same time that every diabetes association in the world, what doctors were being taught, what dietitians were being taught, what the American Diabetes Association had there on the website was it's a chronic and progressive disease. Everybody knew it was a lie because if you lost weight, your diabetes would either get better or go away. So to me, it was this horrifying sort of divide between what the sort of authorities were saying, which was a complete fabrication and very harmful to people, right? You tell them that they can't do anything about it, they won't do anything about it, right? You should be telling them they can do something about it and telling them how. So there's this horrifying divide between what the medical authorities were saying and what was the truth. And the truth is that it was a reversible disease, but you had to focus on weight loss. So I got very interested in that question of weight loss, which is how I sort of started really thinking about that entire problem of calories, because I had believed it was all about calories for so long as well. But it simply wasn't true. It didn't hold up to any rigorous thinking about the problem. And this whole problem of weight gain was more of a hormonal issue, and if you fix that, and there are various ways you can fix that. Changing the diet is probably the best way, but also using things like intermittent fasting as a tool could be very effective. Then you can reverse the type 2 diabetes, and as I started to implement it in my clinic, I actually saw the most sort of amazing results. It was like, for example, one fellow, I'd been treating him for like 10 years, and he had type 2 diabetes, and he was very rigorous. He wanted to get better, but I had given him sort of the standard but wrong advice. Then I told him, okay, well, what you need to do is restrict your carbohydrates. If your body has too much glucose, why are you eating glucose, right? That doesn't make any sense. So if you think about type 2 diabetes, your blood glucose or blood sugar is high. We know that certain foods will raise your blood glucose. If you eat bread, you're eating glucose because it's a starch, so it's glucose, and therefore your blood glucose goes up. If you eat an equivalent amount of calories, say of an egg, which is proteins and fats, you're not eating glucose, you're eating amino acids and triglycerides. So certain foods will raise your blood glucose, certain foods don't raise your blood glucose. So why were you eating foods that raise your blood glucose? It didn't make any sense, but that was the standard advice. So I told him to do that. I told him that you could use intermittent fasting because if you don't eat, your body will simply burn off that glucose and your blood glucose will get better. And he was on like 100 units plus of insulin. And, I simply made a few changes to his diet, and within a month, I swear, he came off all of diabetic medications, and his A1C went down to like 5.9, which actually classified him as a non-diabetic, which is sort of insane. Like, to me, it was sort of eye-opening that I had treated this fellow so incredibly incorrectly. And it was a standard way that everybody's treating him. Like, he had other specialists, other doctors who were treating him the exact same way. But nevertheless, it was a patient that I treated that really had been done a very big disservice not having known that information. So that's where I started to write about it, and I was like, oh wow, this is like sort of insane. So I wrote about it in the Diabetes Code, which was about how you could actually reverse type 2 diabetes, and that got published in 2018. It wasn't until 2021 that the American Diabetes Association finally said that it's a disease that can be reversed. There's criteria for remission. It's a reversible disease. It's like, goodness, it took, you know, all this time and me calling it the biggest lie in type 2 diabetes for them to finally admit what was pretty obvious to anybody who would think about it. Like, I don't think anybody really thought about it for a long time. Or if they did, they simply went with a consensus, which is, again, slightly horrifying to me.
As Dr. Fung mentions, an excellent zero-cost way to help your body burn body fat and also prevent chronic health conditions is to incorporate two strategies: intermittent fasting or a fasting schedule, and also lowering your carbohydrates. And later in the episode, Dr. Fung will talk more about how to incorporate these two strategies. But as you do this, you might experience some side effects like nausea, fatigue, and headaches. And this is quite normal because your body is shifting towards using ketones for energy as opposed to glucose. So, an excellent zero cost way to help is to use some high quality salt. You can salt your meals and you can also salt your water. But over time, if this doesn't help, I would highly recommend that you use a high quality electrolyte supplement. And the one that I recommend is Element because Element contains the right amount of sodium, potassium, and magnesium. The great thing about Element is that it doesn't contain any nasties, any preservatives, and nothing artificial. And I like to use the raw, unflavored option in my morning coffee. My husband loves the chocolate salt and the watermelon salt in his coffee and his other drinks. And Element has also launched their new sparkling water range. And right now, Element is offering this free sample pack on any purchase. So you're going to get 8 single servings of Element to try for free. So if you want this, just head to drinkelement.com/, 5-minute body. That's DRINKLMNT.com / 5-minute body to get this free sample pack. Let's talk about hormonal theory versus calorie theory. Let's talk about the hormones first because that's the answer. And then if people can understand that, they'll understand how to burn body fat. They'll understand how to reverse metabolic disease. Now, you alluded to this earlier. It's about insulin. So when your insulin is elevated, that is telling your body to store fat. Let's talk about in terms of when somebody eats some food. So it could be like even a peanut butter sandwich with whole grain bread. Sounds pretty healthy. It could be a low fat muffin. In terms of the food energy, when you eat that food, what's actually physiologically happening in the body?
So if you eat, say, that food, the insulin is going to go up. And insulin is a hormone. It's a natural hormone. Everybody says I'm trying to demonize it. I'm not. It's a natural hormone. But the issue is that if it's too high, it's bad. If it's too low, it's bad. And that's no different than any other hormone. Thyroid hormone. If it's too high, it's bad. If it's too low, it's bad. I'm not saying that thyroid hormone is bad for you, but you want to have it in the normal range. So insulin's job, it has many jobs, but one of its jobs is to tell you to store energy. And this is a survival mechanism, obviously. So if you're, a caveman or cavewoman and food is scarce and stuff, so when you eat, you want to be able to store some of that. So your body will store that in the form of body fat. It's a store of calories, sort of no more and no less, but it's regulated. That is, the hormones tell you when to put it in and when to take it out. So when insulin goes up, you simply tell your body that you want to take the calories that you're eating right now, and you want to store some of it away for future use, which is smart, right? And it turns off fat burning and it turns off sugar burning. So, your body has 2 sources of energy: glucose, which is sugar, and fat. Okay, so you can store sugar in the form of glycogen in the liver, and you can store fat in the form of body fat. When insulin goes up, what happens is that you stop burning glucose and you stop burning fat. So insulin inhibits lipolysis, which is the breakdown of fat, and it inhibits glycolysis, which is the glycogenolysis, which is the breaking down of glycogen. So you basically stop burning sugar, you stop burning fat, and you store it, right? So that's sensible. If you're eating it, then you don't want to use your stores. You want to, because you're putting it in, not taking it out. So essentially, when you're eating, you're storing calories. That's what insulin is telling you to do. If the food that you eat shoots your insulin way up high, you're going to store more of it. If your insulin goes down, only then can you actually burn those sugar and fat, which are those stores of calories. Because when insulin goes down, your body senses, okay, so I'm not getting food anymore, so I have no source of energy coming in. I need to use my own stores of energy and burn it. Right? So not difficult. When you eat, insulin goes up, you store energy. When insulin is down, which happens when you don't eat, then that's when you burn calories in the form of sugar or fat. So therefore, if you really want to burn fat, you simply cannot have insulin way high, because you're fighting yourself all the time. So even if you cut your calories, but you keep your insulin levels very high, you can't burn those calories. So what happens? So say you eat 2,000 calories. Normally you burn 2,000 calories. Now you drop it to 1,500 calories going in. But you keep insulin levels very high because you're eating, very high carbohydrate foods. You're snacking all the time. You're eating all the time. Well, if you're only taking in 1,500, but you can't burn sugar, you can't burn your stores of fat, what's going to happen? Well, the only way you can balance this equation of 1,500 going in and 2,000 going out is for you to drop how much you burn from 2,000 to 1,500. So people talk about this because it's this metabolic rate, which is how much energy you're burning, now has gone down. And happens with dieting because you haven't watched what's happening with your calories, with your hormones, because you've kept the insulin too high. Now you use something like intermittent fasting, for example, where you allow insulin levels to fall. As you allow insulin levels to fall, you take away this block to fat burning and sugar burning. So now suppose you eat 1,500 calories because you dropped one meal. However, because you allow your insulin levels to fall, you can take 500 calories out of your fat stores. So you've got 1,500 in food, you've got 500 from your body fat stores. So you don't have to drop the energy expend, the 2,000 calories. So therefore, that's exactly what you want to happen, right? So keeping your insulin levels high is really bad from a number of issues. So the thing is that some people have taken that and said, well, it's all about carbohydrates, cutting carbs. It's not necessarily, because there's a lot of things that contribute between the carbohydrate and the insulin response. So lots of things will influence it. Things such as what else you eat your carbohydrates with, sort of vinegars and acids will influence it. If you eat the carbohydrates first versus last, that makes a difference to how much insulin response you have, how processed those carbohydrates are. So you can take two foods, like oatmeal, for example. You can compare steel cut oats to instant oats, and you'll find that one has a much higher glycemic index, which measures how high your glucose and insulin goes up. Right. So when you process a food, like with instant oatmeal, you get much higher glycemic index, which is going to drive your insulin levels much higher, which is going to drive the insulin much more. So the whole idea is that it's not simply about calories. Calories is not the sort of be all and end all. When you lower your calories, you're going to lose weight. No, you don't have to. If you lower your calories, you simply burn less, right? If you eat less and you burn less, you don't lose weight. That also balances the equation. So people talk about, it's the first law of thermodynamics. It's like people who say that clearly don't understand what I'm talking about, because, if you think about it, it's thermodynamics is about where energy goes. That's exactly what I'm talking about, right? What's going in, what's going out, and what's being stored. There are three variables, right, that have to balance. When you change one of them, which is the amount of calories you put in, you can balance that with either the calories that you store, which is body fat, or the calories you burn, right? So if you eat less but burn less, your body fat stays the same. So, it's about tracking that energy and where it goes. That is, if you gain too much, body fat, it's not necessarily because you're eating excessive calories. It could simply be that those calories stimulate excessive. You're storing too much of those calories. Right? That's a possibility. Processed foods is sort of a classic because, a lot of processed foods drive that insulin spike up. So in terms of absorption, when you eat, a whole grain, or, if you eat things that are very unprocessed, your body takes a while to digest it. So glucose sort of goes up very slowly and insulin goes up very slowly. When you eat a processed version, the glucose spikes up, the insulin spikes up. And that's why people talk about ultra processed foods now and why they're so bad for you. But the people who only look at calories or only look at carbs say, oh, there's no difference in the number of calories. It's like, but you're not thinking about the rest of physiology. There's a whole lot of physiology. What's happened to the hormones? And it's not simply insulin. There are other hormones that are involved, like GLP-1s, GIP, and synthetic tone, and cortisol. So there's a whole lot of other hormonal systems that do play a role as well. So you have to think about that. And that's why I'm always, I'm always trying to just tell people about this is how it works, because once you understand how it works, you can decide which part of the process that is the problem for you. If it's that you're eating too much ultra processed foods, then you cut that down, right? You might eat, and I remember reading this very interesting study about the Southern diet there's talking about. And it was people who ate a lot of very highly processed foods in the deep South, where there is a lot of obesity. And the interesting part is that when you actually tally the number of calories they're eating, it actually wasn't much different than anybody else. So people in Mississippi, for example, who are eating this very highly processed diet, we're eating about the same number of calories as everybody else in the nation, like Colorado, where they have very little obesity, for example. It was the quality of those calories. One was very highly processed and one was not, and that was the difference. Not the calories, but the processing, which influenced the hormone response.
Absolutely. I'm thinking about people that say, look, I get it. It's about lowering insulin. But Dr. Fung, you need to be in a calorie deficit. You cannot lose weight, even because if you eat in a calorie surplus, as well as address hormones, so lowering the insulin, you're still going to not lose weight. Does that work out that way, or is it something else?
No, it always is. It always is a calorie deficit if you lose weight. But there never actually is a calorie deficit, right? It's a balanced equation. That is, if you look at body fat equals calories in minus calories out, right? There's no inequality there. It's a balanced equation. There are three variables that have to balance. So if you're going to, say you start to, the problem with that is that if you say it's a calorie deficit, then you say, okay, how are you going to generate that calorie deficit? That's the question, not that is there a calorie deficit. When you have a calorie deficit, it means that, because that's two of the variables, that means body fat is going down. Essentially, you're taking calories out of your storage system, right? That's what you want to do. Well, how are you going to do that, right? So that's the question. So it's not that there is a calorie deficit. It's sort of like saying, if you have alcoholism, drunkenness equals alcohol in minus alcohol out. And I say, well, people are drunk because they're suffering from depression or something like that, right? And it's like, oh, that's not the problem. The problem is alcohol. You need to be in an alcohol deficit. It's like, that's stupid, right? It's about treating the depression, right? It's the alcoholism, right? It's the depression which drives the alcoholism, which drives you to drink more alcohol in over alcohol out, right? It's what's driving the alcohol in greater than alcohol out. Same thing. What's driving you to store more is what's driving calories in minus calories out, right? So it's about what comes first and what comes last. They both happen, but which comes first and which comes last. So if you think the calories comes first, then you simply say cut 500 calories from your diet every day and you will lose a pound a week. That's the standard advice that we've given for 30 years. Has it helped? Not at all. Like, not at all. The obesity epidemic has gone way up. So then what happens, of course, is that people say, well, we gave this advice and people didn't listen to it, right? It's like, okay, but now you're blaming people as opposed to the advice that you're giving. You think the advice, like if, you give a certain advice, which is cut your calories, and it doesn't work. Like objectively, it hasn't worked because obesity has gone up. So either the advice is bad or the people are bad. So you're blaming people. You're saying the advice is good and people are just really bad people. They're lazy. They don't want to listen. And that's where you get all this stuff with fat shaming and stuff, right? Because it's this idea that if you're fat, it's because you're lazy and you have no willpower. I don't actually believe that's true. I think that there's a hormonal balance, which is driving the sort of weight gain, which is causing the calories in to be excessive calories out. That is, for example, if you take the wrong food, which is you eat a lot of junk food, which spikes your insulin, all those calories goes into storage, right? It goes all into storage. That leaves you ravenous, so you can eat more, right? You go get another bag of chips, right? So yes, your calories in, excess exceeds your calories out. That is the only way that you get body fat storage. But what's driving you to store all this? What's driving you to eat all that? It's because you haven't eaten the right food, right? That's where it's like it's one of these things where you say, if you say body fat equals calories in, calories out, what's the primary driving force here? I think it's the body fat. The body fat is saying, feed me more, feed me more, feed me more. You're eating more, you're driving all those calories into storage, which leaves you with nothing left. So you either eat more or you decrease your metabolic rate. But the primary event was the increase in body fat, which is driven by the hormones telling you to increase your body fat. So therefore, if you don't pay attention to that, just like if you don't pay attention to the depression, then you say, oh, it's all about alcohol. You have no willpower. Like, you're just drinking alcohol. It's alcohol in minus alcohol out. That's the first law of thermodynamics. You can't create alcohol from nothing. So the whole idea is that it's you're not looking at the right sort of end of it. You're looking at the result, not the cause. And then trying to make the treatment, like the treatment of alcoholism is just don't drink alcohol. Well, sure. But you haven't addressed the actual cause, which is depression. Same thing. If you have, say, a food addiction, or if you eat ultra-processed foods, which leads you to have very high insulin, which leads you to store a lot of body fat, right? Because insulin tells your body to store body fat, which leads you to have excess calorie intake of these ultra-processed foods. Well, the problem is the ultra-processed foods, right? So you need to fix that, not say, just eat fewer calories, right? Because if you're eating fewer calories of that, you can burn fewer calories and still gain that weight, right? So it's really what is the primary driving event and what is the sort of end result. So they do go together in that you do have calories, but it's the effect, not the cause.
I'm glad that you said that. I had Dr. Ben Bickman on the podcast as well, and it is important to understand it is both, but the calories is not the driving factor; it's the hormones. So once you fix the hormones by dropping the insulin, we're going to talk about the best strategy to drop your insulin, as well as diet and food and things to eat and not to eat. But if you fix the hormones, fix the insulin, you're not hungry. If you're not hungry, you tend to eat less and you eat until you feel satiated and what your body actually needs rather than forcing lower calories. Let's talk about fixing hormones, lowering your insulin predominantly. So, we're going to first talk about fasting because you are, I guess, the founder of intermittent fasting, but you kind of say that you're not the founder, you just spoke about it first.
Yeah, because it's been used for thousands of years. But the thing is that fasting is simply a period of time that you allow. When you set aside a period of time not eating, you're going to allow your insulin levels to fall, right? And that's the whole problem when you eat all the time, is that you're not allowing your insulin levels to fall. And so only when you allow those insulin levels to fall, that you now signal to your body to start pulling those calories back out of storage, right? That's really the only way you can do that, which I always thought was funny because people are saying you should eat 10 times a day. That was the prevailing wisdom when I started talking about it. And it's like, then you should eat 10 times a day to lose weight. I'm like, how do you expect that to happen? Like, physiologically, you simply cannot lose body fat when your insulin levels are high and you're eating. You can't, because your body is getting the instructions to store calories, not burn calories. So essentially, if the only time that you can actually pull those calories out of storage is to let insulin fall and fasting is probably the most efficient way to get there, then why don't you simply extend the period of time you spend fasting? It totally makes sense, right? From a physiologic standpoint, it makes sense. There's no reason why you didn't do it. People have done it for thousands of years. It's, you read about it in, the Bible, you read about it in every sort of major religious texts, and Buddhism and Hinduism and, every other major religion, Islam, whatever you want to do, there's fasting built into it. So therefore, it's not some crazy thing that I just sort of made up, right? It's been used for thousands of years. So if there's a problem with it, we would have known about it ages ago. So now that we actually have a problem with excess obesity, why can't you use it then as a tool to improve your metabolic health? Because you're allowing your body to normalize those insulin levels that are too high. That is, your insulin levels are too high, so the fasting allows you to bring it down. Is it fun? No, not really. I didn't say it was fun.
Why is it not fun? It's actually really easy. My God, it's like, for me, it was a lifesaver, even doing a 16/8. And the best thing about fasting or intermittent fasting, it's so flexible. So you don't have to have these prescribed must do 8 hours, must do 6 hours, or OMADs. It's very flexible during the week, during the month, during your life.
Yeah, exactly. That's how people have always used it. Like, so certain times, certain periods of the year, for example, you're supposed to fast, right? I remember, I'd go to church, Catholic church, and every year around Easter time, they talk about Lent and fasting and all that, like every single year. Like, and it's like, okay, well, even as they were talking about it, the doctors are saying nobody should fast. You should eat 10 times a day. It's like, oh, that's strange. Why is there this strange dichotomy between what people had accepted as a healthy sort of longevity wellness practice, right? Because it was always couched in those terms, right? It's a purification, it's a detoxification, right? That's what fasting has been called. And this idea that fasting was extremely hard and bad on the body, right? It's like, it was a very strange sort of thing. So it's simply one way for people to achieve. And I thought it was funny too, because as some of the first studies went through, I remember thinking, okay, fasting, if you think about the diet in the 60s and 70s, you ate dinner around 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock, perhaps, and you ate breakfast around 7, 8 o'clock in the morning, perhaps. Then you went to school, right? And it's like, okay, so that's like 13 to 14 hours a day without even thinking about it. That wasn't fasting. That was just normal eating, right? There's a period of time to eat and a period of time to fast. So 13, 14 hours. And then they do these studies where they go, okay, we did a 16-hour fast for people, and then let people eat whatever they wanted. Like, that's not going to be nearly enough for most people, because for some people it's going to be okay, but so then a lot of the early studies were like, oh, we didn't show any benefits. It's like, yeah, on the one hand, you extended the fasting period by a little bit. On the other hand, you told people to eat whatever they wanted, right? So it's like, okay, well, that's not good. Like, you're not supposed to do that. What clinic has? I've never been in a clinic where I told people you can eat whatever you want, right? It's like, but that's how they did the studies, right? Or they tell people to fast for a period of time and then make sure they ate extra on their other days. I'm like, okay, why would you do that? Like, that's not advice I would ever give, right? So that's why some of the early studies were quite, bad. But now we have actually a number of studies looking at it, for reversing type 2 diabetes. There's, a number of studies now that have shown that it's possible. In fact, it makes perfect sense from a physiologic standpoint. It makes perfect sense from, from a personal standpoint. Like, it's flexible. There's this history. There's this, history of humanity and fasting that has been there for a long, long time, that we sort of ignored as is sort of just being brought back. So it's that was one of the things that is really, one of the things I always said was, it's just a tool, right? It's, if you want to use it, great. If you don't want to use it, that's fine. You don't have to. But if you're failing, that is something that you can add.
Absolutely. What do you think about breakfast?
I think breakfast is, the thing is that you can eat breakfast, but remember, the meal that breaks your fast is the meal that breaks your fast, whether it's in the morning or not. It doesn't matter. Like, you can break your fast at noon, you can break your fast in the evening. It's still when you break your fast, so you can skip it. So, it's some people, they skip breakfast, and other people will say, oh, that's really, really bad for you. But it's not. At some point, you have to break your fast, right? I mean, if you wake up at 7 and break your fast at 7, it's fine. If you wake up at 11 and break your fast at 11, it's fine. It doesn't mean you need to set your alarm, wake up 4 hours early to eat, and then go back to sleep. Like, that doesn't make any sense. The whole thing about breakfast, on the one hand, if you eat your calories earlier, it is better for you than eating later, right? So if you eat earlier, it's not, then you have the rest of the day to work it off and so on. If you eat very late, then of course, then you have nothing to do but store it, right? So if you eat at like 11 p.m., a big meal, well, what are your body going to do with that, right? Well, you're going to go to sleep, then your body's just going to store it. There's really nothing you can do. Whereas if you eat early, you're going to be able to, you know, use it through the day and eat less through the rest of like the lunch and dinner. So skipping breakfast is not a bad thing, but it's not it's not necessarily a good thing if you're pushing all your meals super late either, right? So you just have to find a balance. I've always said that, it's not really the most important meal of the day. It's just a meal, and it has to fall within where where you take it. There's lots of different things you can do. So some people eating breakfast is great because then they feel full, they eat less throughout the rest of the day, and they don't eat as much late at night, which is worse for you. So if on the other hand you're not hungry at breakfast, then a reasonable strategy is to not eat breakfast and then just eat, a healthier meal at lunchtime. The problem with breakfast is not that, it's not that it's early or whatever. The problem is that everybody's in a rush. Everybody's looking for something which is fast with no cleanup, which means usually some kind of pre-packaged, ultra-processed food, right? So you're eating not like eggs and, sausage, which was sort of this traditional breakfast, because nobody wants to cook it, eat it, clean it up, and then go. So you're going to wake up like an hour earlier just for that. So what do they eat? Like breakfast cereal, right? Lots of sugar, lots of refined food, ultra processed for sure. Or they eat slice of bread with jam, which is all processed and sugary, right? So that's the problem. Or you eat a Pop-Tart, which is all processed and sugar and refined foods, right? So the problem with breakfast is not that it's early. Like if you eat a good breakfast, that's fine, but nobody wants to spend the time. So then it's a very highly processed meal, which is bad for you, right? So you're better off not eating it and eating something nice for lunch, which you cook and is relatively unprocessed and all that sort of thing.
We're going to talk about specifics, fasting lengths, and foods to eat. But before that, I wanted to get your thoughts about a study from the American Heart Association. It showed a 91% increase risk of death from cardiovascular events with intermittent fasting a few months ago. People might have heard of that study. Can you just share your thoughts about that?
Yeah, that study was basically garbage. What they did was they took people and they asked them, how long do you eat for? What's your fasting duration and so on? And they took it from, I think, 2002 to 2017 or something like that. And what they said was that people who ate, within a 8-hour eating window, like a 16-8, was associated with higher risk of heart disease. The problem with association is that it doesn't show causation, right? So just because something is associated doesn't mean that something caused it. So in this case, first of all, nobody was using fasting for weight loss. So it wasn't a weight loss diet, right? From 2002 to 2016, when I published the Obesity Code, basically nobody was using fasting. It wasn't even, nobody mentioned it. Like you can look on Google Trends, you can look at whatever. There was like zero mention of it. So the people who were not eating not because they want to lose weight, but they were not eating for other reasons. And you say, okay, well, what are those other reasons? Well, maybe they have other illnesses. Maybe they have cancer. Maybe they have alcoholism. Maybe they're on drugs. Like a lot of other reasons why people are not eating properly, but they weren't doing it to lose weight at that period of time. So therefore, if you took a group of people where there's a lot more sick people, cancer patients, drug patient, people on drugs, people on alcohol, well, you're going to have a higher risk. The study, they always forget to mention that if you look at people who ate over a 10-hour span, so suppose you ate breakfast at 8 a.m. and ate dinner at 6 p.m. So not bad, pretty reasonable sort of eating schedule. Well, that was associated, I think, with a 61% increased risk of heart disease. So are you telling me that in order, like, that doesn't even make any sense. If you're eating a normal eating schedule, that's worse for you than virtually any other risk factor in medicine. Like, you know, if you're not exercising, it's worse than for heart disease than anything else. That doesn't even make any sense. So that whole association study was just garbage, because it's sort of like saying that, I took a whole bunch of people who had gray hair, and I found that their risk of dying was three times more than people without gray hair. It's like, well, duh, people with gray hair are older. Like, that's the reason, right? Why are you doing this stupid study? Same thing with the fasting. Like, you took a group of people who were not eating for many, many different reasons, right? Many of them puts them at higher risk of heart disease. And then you say, well, it's because they're not eating. That's what caused it. No, it's not what caused it. It's just an association. There's a million associations. Just like if you say, well, if you look at, eating ice cream, you'll find that when you eat ice cream, your risk of drowning is like, 5 times. Why? Because people eat ice cream in the summer, people swim in the summer. That's why if you're eating ice cream, your risk of drowning is higher. Not because ice cream causes drowning, but because both happen at around roughly the same time. Same thing, right? You take a group of people who are not eating for some other reason, and then you try and blame that for the higher risk of heart disease. So it's a complete garbage study. It's like the worst study that ever done, but it's super clickbaity.
That's why I asked, because I think that if we have this conversation about fasting and lowering the insulin, these things that make headlines, they scare people. And that's what they're trying to do. It's the same thing as breakfast is the most important meal of the day. Why? Because Kellogg's wants to sell you a cereal. But if you eat these foods that we're going to talk about and do a fasting window or a fasting length, you can naturally burn fat, and you can also prevent metabolic disease. It is simple, but we have to take out the clickbaity, the garbage information in the background. Let's talk about fasting windows. If somebody wants to start fasting to drop their insulin, to burn fat, to prevent metabolic disease, is there a best fasting length?
There isn't really. They can all work. Some people like different ones. So some people like long fast and some people like short fast. So every day you're supposed to have a fasting period, right? That's where the word breakfast comes from, right? You break your fast, right? It means you have to fast to break your fast, right? You're not supposed to be eating all the time. Fasting is when you burn your calories. Eating is when you store your calories, right? So you have to have a period where you're not eating, right? And that's what the word itself means. So every day you should have about 12 to 14 hours. That's just regular, right? It means don't eat anything after dinner until breakfast time, right? And that's essentially a 12-hour plus 12 to 14-hour fast. Then if you want to lose weight, then you can push it up. You can do 16. Generally, if you do, a shorter fast, then you have to do it more frequently. If you do a longer fast, you don't have to do it as frequently. And you can do any of them. So 16 hours, you can go 18, you can do 24, you could do 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, 5 days, whatever you really feel like. So there's a lot of people who, like one versus the other. And I have a lot of people, I'll tell you, who like the long fast and not so much the shorter fast. So they'll still maintain that sort of 12-hour fast, but they don't do the 16 every day, right? Because it's less, they don't like it. Like, everybody's different, right? Some people like one thing, some people like the other thing. It's not right or wrong. You simply have to adjust it to whatever works for you, right? So that's the thing. So you have to sort of experiment and see what works for you, because obviously if you're one of these people that really likes the 3-day fast every so often, then you should do that, because if that maintains you at your goal, then good on you. Then there's no reason why you shouldn't do that, as opposed to other people who would say, oh, I can't do that. I can't go more than, 18 hours. So they do 16 hours or 18 hours and it does well for them. Well, they should do that and you should do that. So there's no right or wrong answer, but you do have to sort of experiment a little bit to find out what's best.
Okay, I want to talk about extended fasting because people generally want to do the extended fasting to get the therapeutic benefits in terms of perhaps cancer, to get into ketosis, perhaps using water fasting. Can you talk about why eating too much protein might affect your results from extended fasting or trying to get into autophagy?
Yeah, protein is mostly for autophagy. So this is sort of an ongoing discussion, because if you look at autophagy, this is a process where your body sort of breaks down some of its subcellular components. And it sounds really bad, but it's actually not. It's actually really good for you. So one of the things is that there's autophagy and there's mitophagy, which is autophagy for mitochondria, which is the sort of energy generating parts of the cell. And the reason it's good to break down these sort of subcellular components is because after you break them down, then you can build new ones. And same thing with the mitochondria. Once you break them down, then you can generate new ones. And when you think about that process of breaking down old stuff and building new stuff, it's really a process of rejuvenation. So really, when you're talking about autophagy, it's very popular in terms of longevity and all these people who like to discuss it. And one thing that really stops autophagy is protein. So amino acids. When you eat amino acids, that really stops autophagy in its tracks. And you can see how that might be one of these sort of not so good things from a longevity standpoint, because it's just like if you keep the same house without renovating for a long time, everything just starts to get old, as opposed to if you're breaking down, tearing out the old bathroom, putting in a new bathroom, tearing out the old kitchen, putting in a new kitchen, everything starts, looks good and works better. Same thing with autophagy. You really want to break things down and build them back up, which is what fasting does, because it stops the protein, which is activating, when you stop protein, you activate autophagy, which is the breakdown, and then fasting increases growth hormone so that when you rebuild new. So that's that renovation, rejuvenation process. So the problem is that protein is sort of this two-sided thing. If you don't get enough protein, well, you don't have the building blocks to build new stuff. If you eat too much protein, then perhaps you may activate this mTOR, which is a nutrient sensor for amino acids, and stop autophagy kind of cold. So it's sort of this nobody knows where to go with all this. On the one hand, there are people who say, oh, you should take drugs like rapamycin to stop mTOR. On the other hand, they're saying, oh, well, but then you need to eat more protein, which increases mTOR. So we don't know really where this whole process is going to lie out. My guess is that it's going to be one of these cyclical things. So once in a while, you should have sort of lower protein, like during fasting, and then the other times you should have relatively high protein because you want to rebuild it. So it could be one of these things that needs to cycle between one and the other, as opposed to sort of you need this, right? And the thing is that everybody thinks that you need this, but the human body never is like this. It's always up and down, up and down. It's always cycles, right? Same as fasting and feeding it. You have to fast and then you have to feed. You don't just go all the way across. It's actually really bad for you to do that. It's probably the same for a lot of things. Same as muscle growth, for example. You want to stress it sometimes. So that's how you build muscle, right? If you lift the same 5-pound weight all the time, that's not nearly as good for you if once in a while you lift 20-pound weights, right? It's just the way the human body is. It doesn't really like that sort of stable sort of thing, because it doesn't keep it healthy.
Exactly. The body's always trying to stay in homeostasis, so it's trying to keep balance and then stay the same. So we need to vary our fasting lengths, maybe. We need to vary kind of what we eat, maybe vary the protein. Let's talk about foods, because along with the fasting, just not eating all the time. So even if we do like a 12, 14-hour eating window, and then you can do a 16-8 and then progress it from there. But in that eating window, we need to think about what we're eating. What do you think about foods like oatmeal?
Um, so it's a mix, right? So it's not that you need to be um, super low carb, for example. Really, what you're trying to optimize is the insulin, and different types of oatmeal will have different effects. So if you eat steel cut oats, it has a much different effect than instant oats. If you put a lot of sugar in it, like with the instant oats, then that's going to have further detrimental effects. So the oatmeal wasn't bad, because you have to realize that a lot of cultures are based on, starches and stuff. Like we've eaten them throughout history. So therefore, that can't be the sole reason. The way we process them is relatively new, right? So, it's one thing to eat corn, for example. Then you have all our sort of genetically modified corn. So therefore, it may not be the same, but then you turn it into corn chips, for example, and that's completely different, right? And you throw a bunch of artificial seasonings and flavors into them. Well, that's completely different than the original corn that you ate, 30 years ago. So there is a difference. And I think ultimately, and this is what I said in the obesity code, is that it's ultimately the processing of foods that is going to probably be the most important thing. So eating, sort of making sure you have your proper fasting schedule, but when you're eating, you making sure that you eat unprocessed foods, because when you eat unprocessed foods, it's very difficult to sort of go overboard on them, right? Overboard means that you eat them and you can't stop eating them because they have such, say, low satiety value, right? So if you eat, an apple, you usually stop after one. But, if you drink apple juice, you can drink the juice of 5 apples, for example, right? So that extra step of juicing them or processing them has made you sort of take too much of a certain component of it, which is the juice part, right? But that's also the part that has the no satiety, right? Because you're not eating the actual pulp, you're not eating the fiber. So all you're getting is the juice of it, which is a lot of the sugar and not a lot of the stuff that's going to make you full. So the processing, that step of processing, same as you can go from steel cut oats to instant oats, you've taken that step and made it a much less sort of healthy food. That is, if you look at the glucose spike and insulin spike, it's much different. You can do the same with virtually any other foods, right? Like you can take a food and then turn it into an ultra processed food, right? You can take chicken and then you can turn it into a chicken nugget, right? And it's not the same. Like, it's much different. And how much you eat is much different, because remember, when they process foods, they often lower the satiety value of the food, so that when you eat it, normally you eat a piece of, a food is going to make you full. But if they do something to it, process it, usually like turn it into corn chips or something, they'll put additives and stuff so that you can keep eating them, right? Because they want to sell it to you. They want you to eat more. So therefore, that value, if you go back towards the unprocessed foods, that's going to make you healthier for longer, because it's going to be that natural food that is going to make you full, right? There are all these mechanisms in our body, hormonal mechanisms, to stop us from overeating. Those are what most processing tries to circumvent, so that you'll eat more, right? It's deliberate.
Well, I was going to ask you about Diet Coke, but that's full on because I have a list here, because people, they eat these foods. So although it sounds so simple to many other people, but for other people, they're like, well, doesn't have any calories. And we spoke about the calorie assumption, but diet soda is also processed. So what you're saying is, first of all, eat whole, unprocessed foods. But I wanted to ask about the carbohydrate concept, because then you have other people, because it's all about lowering your insulin. So fasting is one way if people can do it. However, when you eat carbohydrates, even in the whole unprocessed form, that's going to raise your insulin. So conversely, is it not better to eat perhaps protein and fat and vegetables?
For sure. Sometimes it works for some people. So, but it's not simply the carbohydrate. The total amount of carbohydrate is one component of how much insulin it does. It goes, right. So same if you look at oatmeal, steel cut oats versus instant oats, for example, same food, same calories, same carbs, but one has almost double the insulin effect of the other, right? Because of that processing, right? They've shredded it. It gets absorbed much faster because they got rid of a lot of the fiber of it. So same foods, but much different insulin effect. So therefore, one of them you might be able to tolerate pretty reasonably. The other you can't, because it's been processed to do that. So cutting the total number of carbs is a large component of the insulin effect, but it's not the only impact of it, right? So therefore, you can cut down all carbs. That's a reasonable strategy, but you don't always have to. Some people will tolerate a certain amount of it, right? And that's the idea, is that you want to balance those. The whole Diet Coke thing is interesting because a lot of people tolerate it fine, right? There's, for some people it's not a problem, but there are other people who simply they drink this diet soda and they get really much hungrier than if they didn't, right? And it's the sweetness of it. It's because of whatever chemical compound it is, and therefore, for those people, you can't say, "Oh, it's no calories, so therefore it's okay." It's like, no, the problem is that it's activating certain neural pathways with the sweetness that is making you hungry. If it's making you hungry, it's going to make you eat more, which is going to be detrimental to you, right? So it's not simply the calories, right? It's the total effect, including the hormones, because it does have hormonal effects on the body. Insulin is the main one, but there are others as well. So GLP-1s is another one, for example, and that's obviously a very important hormone system because they use it for Ozempic and things like that.
Let's talk about GLP-1s, a very popular weight loss medication. This is the last thing we're going to talk about because I want to know what's better, fasting or Ozempic?
I think they're different. See, the whole idea with Ozempic is that by stimulating GLP-1s, and remember, it's also very super physiologic, so it's not a normal amount of GLP-1. It's a very high level of GLP-1. That's basically makes you not hungry, which makes you not want to eat. So it really does something very similar to fasting, because a lot of people will not eat while they're on this because they're nauseated. So it's not that they're against each other, that one is better than the other. They can actually work together. So it's not a problem. The problem is that if you don't learn good habits while you're taking the Ozempic, good dietary habits, then when you stop it, the weight comes right back. So it's a very temporary fix. So because metabolic disease is a process that takes decades, what are you going to do? Take it for decades? It's possible, but it's not easy. So, I've prescribed a lot of it because it's a drug that has good effects for diabetes. For example, I take care of a lot of people with diabetes. So I've prescribed it quite heavily over the last 5 years. And I'll tell you that it's far from a panacea. People think it's great, it's going to cure everything. But the truth is that a lot of people just don't stay on it. I saw this study from Blue Cross where they looked at, what happens in the real world. And they saw that, and it was like 169,000 Blue Cross patients. I think only about 25% of people were still on it after a year. And that's pretty close to the experience I have prescribing. A lot of people don't stay on it. Why? Because you get nauseated, because you don't enjoy your foods, because, remember, the whole idea is that if you're not hungry and you're nauseated, you're not going to eat. But it takes away the pleasure of eating. And the pleasure of eating is one of life's great pleasures, right? You think about what all cultures, everybody's like, oh, let's celebrate, let's go get something, go to a nice restaurant, let's get some, something delicious, right? That's how you enjoy yourself, right? That's one of the sort of universal things that all humans do. And if you take that away, well, it's not so fun anymore, right? So it's hard. You can do it for 6 months, but can you do it for 4, 5, 6, 7 years, let alone like 20 years? 20 years is a long time to never enjoy your food, right? After a year, most people are like, you know what? I don't think it's really worth it, right? So the thing about fasting, because it's different. You actually heighten your enjoyment because you're restricting yourself. Therefore, you enjoy it all the more when you do take it. Yes, it is a little harder, but on the other hand, you're learning those good habits that you'll be able to sustain. Because people say, "Oh, fasting's unsustainable." It's like, we've been doing it for thousands of years. Like, it is literally something that people have done for their entire life. If there's anything sustainable, it's fasting, because that has been our tradition, right? In 60s and 70s, people were fasting 12, 14 hours a day, every single day. So don't tell me that's not sustainable. It is sustainable. It's just a matter of adjusting your expectations. So Ozempic is okay. I don't mind it. It's a good drug, as all the drug studies have shown. But it does have a huge downside, and it's more than the nausea, the vomiting, the diarrhea, that kind of thing. It's quite common. It's that sort of taking away the enjoyment of food. Like, you will never be able to enjoy a good meal. People tell me, oh, I go out there and I look at it and I just feel sick. It's like, oh, well, that's nice. Say you're going out to your nice birthday dinner that somebody splurged for you, and you're like, oh my God, I cannot eat that steak. That is literally going to make me throw up, because that's what Ozempic will do, right? And that's what it's supposed to do. That's how it gives you the benefits. But if you can learn how to do it yourself, then you're actually much better off. I don't mind if people want to do it as a crutch, whatever they want to do. I'm not against medications, but it's if you expect it to solve all your problems, then I think you're going to be mistaken. It's actually not that. It's not that effective because not all that many people want to stay on it forever.
It's kind of like a diet. Nobody wants to stay on a diet, but people can just generally do fasting really, really easily.
Yeah, it's a difference, right? It's a difference of saying that I'm going to cut out like whatever diet you want to do. Say you want to be a vegan. So you're going to cut out all meat products for your whole life, or low or zero carbs, so all carbs for the rest of your life. That's very daunting to think about, as opposed to saying, okay, well, I'm going to cut out everything, but only for 2 days or one day or whatever it is. Then tomorrow, I'm going to be able to enjoy a little bit of carbs or meat or whatever it is diet you choose, right? It's a much different experience. So if you say, okay, well, I've gained a bit of weight, so I'm going to do like a lot of fasting for the next 2 weeks. I'm going to have one meal a day, and I'm going to do a 3-day fast, and I'm going to do this. Well, it's only 2 weeks. At the end of 2 weeks, you can go back to eating some things you enjoy. Well, that's a lot different from a psychological standpoint than, okay, well, I've decided I'm never going to have X, Y, Z for the rest of my life. Like, that's a long time. Same thing with Ozempic. Like, you're not going to enjoy anything, or it'll be much diminished, right? That was, it's a reasonable strategy, but it's the same problem as bariatric surgery had, right? It was supposed to cure everything. It didn't. In fact, we rarely see people get that kind of surgery anymore. It just hasn't panned out in the long term. If it was so good, we'd be doing lots of it, that surgery. But the truth is, we rarely do that surgery. We rarely see people doing that surgery.
If there was one thing that you want people to take away from this conversation, what is that one thing?
I think the one thing is to really understand that it's the hormones that drive weight gain and a lot of metabolic disease, because the same hyperinsulinemia that drives a lot of disease. It's not the calories, right? So confusing the two makes you make bad choices, right? So you eat things like, low fat, fake foods because they're low in calories, but in fact, they're actually much worse for you. Let's say eating instant oats as opposed to steel cut oats because it's more convenient, and hey, it's the same number of calories, but not understanding that, hey, it's an ultra processed food. It has different effects on your glucose, different effects on your insulin. So the instant oatmeal is not the same as the steel cut oats, right? So not understanding the hormonal part of things, which is much more complicated, I grant you, than calories, right? People try and boil it down to a very, very simplistic model of calories, which leads them to make bad choices. And then they don't understand, why am I gaining weight? Like, it's the same calories. I'm cutting my calories. It's like, because that wasn't the important issue. That's the thing I hope people try to understand from all this.
I think they will. I'm going to leave all your books and links and resources in the show notes. You have two best-selling books, the Diabetes Code and the Obesity Code, and that has really changed the lives of people. And slowly, slowly, people are understanding these new concepts. It takes time for it to evolve and to get into our minds. But Dr. Fung, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure, and I'm sure we're going to see you very, very soon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining me on this episode with Dr. Jason Fung. You can find the full show notes, including books, reference articles, and free resources at the 5-Minute Body Labs. There is a link in the description of this video. If you're learning from and enjoying these episodes, please hit the subscribe button. That is an excellent zero-cost way to support this free health podcast. You can also find me on other social media accounts. I'm at 5-Minute Body on Instagram and on X, formerly known as Twitter, as I generally share different information to what you'll see here on YouTube. I share health tips and advice that I hear from the best experts. If you have a recommendation of a guest speaker or a comment, please leave that in the YouTube comments as I check every single one. And if you love this episode, you would also enjoy another episode I did with Dr. Ben Bickman. Dr. Bickman explains the scientific way to help your body burn belly fat. Dr. Bickman talks about why hormones is more important than counting calories, the difference between brown and white fat, and a surprising sugar that might help you burn body fat. Finally, thank you for your interest in root cause healing, and I'll see you next week.